Stranded. The acrid stench of burnt metal and scorched earth invaded Lieutenant Ethan Reeves' nostrils as he picked his way through the still smoldering battlefield. Dawn's pale light revealed a grim scene, the broken bodies of both human and Valanth warriors scattered across the blood-soaked ground, testament to the ferocity of the battle that had raged here just hours before. Ethan grimaced, blinking grit from his eyes as he scanned the horizon for any signs of movement. As the sole surviving member of Echo Squad, it fell to him to scout the aftermath and report back on Valanth positions before reinforcements arrived. He just hoped there were any reinforcements left to come. This far-flung corner of the galaxy had become the latest flashpoint in the long and bitter war between the Human Alliance and the Valanth Imperium. What had started as a dispute over frontier colony worlds had escalated into a decades-long conflict that showed no signs of ending. Ethan had spent his entire military career fighting the scaly, reptilian warriors of the Imperium, an implacable foe who seemed to revel in conquest. A soft groan somewhere off to his left snapped Ethan out of his thoughts. He froze, his grip instinctively tightening on his pulse rifle. Slowly, cautiously, he picked his way through the wreckage, all senses on high alert. There, sprawled behind the twisted remains of a Valanth fighter craft, he saw her. She was Valanth. That much was obvious from her glossy crimson scales and double-crested head. One of the Imperium's elite warrior caste, judging by her sleek black combat armor, now cracked and charred from battle. More startling, though, was her condition. Dark purple ichor, the color of Valanth blood, seeped from a deep gash across her thigh, pooling beneath her prone form. Her eyes, large and amber with slitted pupils, fluttered open as Ethan approached, locking onto him with a mixture of fear and defiance. For a long moment, Human and Valanth stared at each other, unmoving. Ethan knew what he should do. Protocol was clear. She was the enemy, and gravely wounded at that. Better to end her quickly and move on. And yet, something about the fierceness of her gaze, the proud tilt of her head, even in the face of death, stayed his hand. "Easy there," Ethan said finally, slowly lowering his rifle. "I'm not going to hurt you." She hissed something in sibilant Valanth, her clawed fingers scrabbling weakly for a weapon that wasn't there. Ethan's translator implant struggled to parse her dialect, spitting out something about dishonorable humans and a glorious death. He sighed. "I'm not here to kill you," he said, taking a cautious step closer. His medic training took over as he knelt down to examine her wound. It was deep and ragged, but thankfully her armor seemed to have taken the worst of the blast. If he could just stop the bleeding. The Valanth female went rigid as Ethan reached for his medkit, her coiled muscles tensing as if to spring. "Steady eye," he murmured, keeping his voice low and soothing like he was gentling a wild animal. "I'm going to patch you up, okay? I'm not your enemy right now." Those keen amber eyes bored into his, searching for any sign of deception. For a heart-stopping moment, Ethan thought she might lunge for him, injured or not. But then, infinitesimally, she relaxed. A soft exhalation hissed from her lipless mouth. "Why? Help me?" She rasped in haltingly accented Alliance standard. "Because I'm tired," Ethan said simply, surprising even himself with his honesty. "Tired of all the killing, tired of this endless war. And because even if you are Valanth, I'm not the kind of man who could abandon an injured female to die alone." Something inscrutable flickered through those alien amber eyes. "I am Zora," she said finally, "of the Tenzak Dol September, and you are either very brave or very foolish, human." "Ethan," he replied with a wry smile as he bent over her wound. "Lieutenant Ethan Reeves, and I've been accused of both. Now hold still." Under Ethan's careful ministrations, Zora slipped in and out of consciousness, her lifeblood washing over his hands as he worked to staunch the bleeding. He frankly marveled that she was even still alive. The resilience of the Valanth never ceased to amaze him. As he applied the last of his medbac's clotting agent to the wound, Zora's eyes fluttered open once more. She peered down at her bound leg, then back up at Ethan. A strange expression crossed her reptilian features. "You could have let me die. It would have been the easier path," she said slowly. "Why expend your resources on an enemy? My kind would not have shown such mercy." Ethan sat back on his haunches, suddenly weary beyond words. In truth, he asked himself the same question. By any measure, he had just committed treason, aiding an enemy combatant. If his superiors found out, he'd be looking at a court-martial at best, a firing squad at worst. And yet, looking into Zora's eyes, he couldn't bring himself to regret it. "Well, maybe that's the problem," he said with a sigh. "We've been so caught up in killing each other for so long, we've forgotten what it means to be human, or valiant, for that matter." He gestured to the carnage around them. "I have to believe we're more than this." Zara was quiet for a long moment, her gaze distant. "Pretty words," she said finally. "But this is war. We are on opposing sides. Your mercy changes nothing." "Maybe not," Ethan acknowledged. "But it's a start." He stood, offering her his hand. She stared at it for a long, considering moment before finally reaching out to clasp it in her own, allowing him to pull her upright. "This changes nothing," she warned, even as she leaned on him for support. "When next we meet on the battlefield, I will not hesitate to kill you." "Likewise," Ethan agreed with a grim smile. "But that's tomorrow's problem. Today, we survive." Together, the unlikely allies limped off into the war-torn landscape, each step an act of defiance against the cycle of violence that had defined their lives. The future was uncertain and fraught with peril. But for now, at least, they weren't facing it alone. Little did they know that this chance meeting would send ripples across the stars, changing the course of the war and their own destinies forever. Unlikely allies. The sun beat down mercilessly on the barren planetscape as Ethan half-carried, half-dragged Zara towards a distant outcropping of rocks. The valiant warrior was heavier than she looked, her dense musculature combined with the weight of her armor, making each step a Herculean effort. But Ethan gritted his teeth and pressed on, driven by the knowledge that their survival depended on finding shelter. Zara, for her part, bore the jostling stoically, though Ethan could feel her body trembling with exhaustion and pain. She had not spoken since their initial exchange, her jaw clenched tight with fierce Valath pride. But her grip on his shoulder told him all he needed to know. For now, at least, they were in this together. As they drew closer to the rocks, Ethan's heart leaped. His keen eyes picked out the unmistakable lines of a prefab structure nestled into the base of the outcropping, an Alliance frontier outpost, or what was left of one. The twisted, blackened hole blasted through one wall told the story of what had happened to its former occupants. "There," he grunted, adjusting his grip on Zara. "We can rest in there, maybe find some supplies." Zara followed his gaze, her slitted pupils narrowing. "An Alliance outpost," she hissed. "You expect me to shelter with the enemy?" Ethan bit back, a sharp retort. "Right now, the Alliance is the least of your worries," he said evenly. "That leg needs proper attention, and we both need a place to lay low. Unless you prefer to take your chances out here." Zara's lip curled, bearing a flash of needle-sharp teeth, but after a long, tense moment, she relented with a curt nod. The outpost's interior was a grim scene of destruction. Overturned furniture, shattered equipment, scorch marks marring every surface. But to Ethan's relief, the structure itself seemed sound. And even better, the faint, telltale hum of a backup generator reached his ears. "Looks like we're in luck," he said, easing Zara down onto a battered but intact cot. "Power's still on. Should keep the worst of the heat out." Zara sat stiffly, her claws digging into the cot's frame as Ethan bent to examine her wound in the brighter light. He grimaced at what he saw. The bleeding had stopped, thanks to the clotting agent, but the gash was deep and angry-looking, the edges puckered and oozing. Infection would be a serious risk in these unsanitary conditions. "I need to clean this properly," he said, already rummaging through the outpost's scattered supplies for a medkit. And you could probably do with some nutrients and fluids. Zara watched him warily, her posture tense and coiled like a snake ready to strike. "Why are you doing this?" she asked abruptly. Ethan paused, a roll of antiseptic bandages in his hand. "Doing what?" "Helping me. Tending my wounds." "You've already done more than honor demanded." Her amber eyes bored into his, searching. "What do you hope to gain?" Ethan blew out a breath, considering the question. Why was he doing this? By any reasonable standard, he'd already gone above and beyond. He could leave her here, make his way back to Alliance lines, and chalk this whole strange interlude up to battlefield stress, and move on. It would certainly be the safer option, but something in him rebelled at the thought. Maybe it was the healer in him, unable to walk away from a being in pain. Maybe it was the bone-deep weariness he felt at the thought of more death, more killing. Or maybe, just maybe, it was the tiny spark of connection he'd felt with this proud, fierce alien warrior. The sense that they were more alike than their respective sides would ever admit. Gain? "I don't know," he said finally, meeting her gaze squarely. I guess I'm just tired of fighting. Tired of seeing every alien as an enemy to be destroyed." He gestured to her wound. "You're a person, Zara. A living, breathing person, no matter what color your blood is. And right now, you need help. That's reason enough for me." For a long, stretched-out moment, Zara simply stared at him, her expression unreadable. Then, to Ethan's shock, she threw her head back and laughed. A dry, rasping sound, but unmistakable. "A person," she repeated, shaking her head. "You humans, always so sentimental." But there was no heat in her voice, and unless Ethan was very much mistaken, a glimmer of something like respect in her eyes. "Yeah, well, we sentimental humans are all you've got right now," Ethan said dryly, moving to kneel beside the cot. "Now hold still. This might sting a bit." As Ethan worked to clean and redress her wound, a strange sort of peace settled over the battered outpost. Soldier and warrior, human and valiant, captor and captive. In this moment, the labels fell away, rendered meaningless by the simple primal act of one being caring for another. And as Zara gradually relaxed under Ethan's careful touch, the hard lines of pain and suspicion smoothing from her face, Ethan felt something shift inside him. A recognition, perhaps, of the fundamental humanity in even this most alien of aliens. A seed of understanding planted in the most unlikely of soils. He didn't know what the future held, or how long this fragile truce would last. But as he finished tying off the last bandage and sat back on his heels, meeting Zora's gaze with a tentative smile, one thing was certain. The universe would never quite look the same again. Dangerous attraction. Days turned into weeks as Ethan and Zara settled into an uneasy rhythm in the abandoned outpost. With no sign of rescue from either side, and Zora's wounds slow to heal, they had little choice but to rely on each other for survival. It was a tense and awkward coexistence at first, marked by long silences and wary glances. They were too different, their histories too steeped in blood and enmity, to trust easily. But necessity, as it often does, proved a powerful bonding agent. Ethan taught Zara how to work the outpost's finicky power generator and water recyclers, while she showed him how to set the kind of clever snares and traps that kept them supplied with fresh meat. He told her stories of growing up on Earth, of green hills and blue skies, and a family he hadn't seen in years. She spoke haltingly of her own childhood on the arid plains of Valen Prime, of the rigid caste system that had shaped her into a warrior from birth. Slowly, painstakingly, they began to see each other as more than just human and valiant, more than the uniforms they wore and the sides they fought for. And with that understanding came a growing sense of kinship and appreciation for the individual beneath the armor. But there was something else growing between them too, as the long days bowled into warm nights. A spark, an electricity that crackled in the air when their eyes met, when their hands brushed as they worked side by side. an attraction as undeniable as it was forbidden. Ethan tried to ignore it at first, to write it off as simple loneliness and proximity. But he couldn't deny the way his heart raced when Zara emerged from the sonic shower, her scales glistening and her lithe, muscular form barely concealed by a towel. Couldn't pretend he didn't dream of running his hands over her taut body, of tasting the alien contours of her mouth. For her part, Zara seemed to take a perverse delight in toying with him, in letting her touch linger just a moment too long, in catching his eye with a smoldering, suggestive gaze. It was a dangerous game, and one Ethan knew he shouldn't be playing. But cooped up in close quarters with nothing but time and tension stretching between them, it was getting harder and harder to remember why. Matters finally came to a head one sweltering evening, as they sat on the roof of the outpost watching the twin moons rise over the desert. Zara had been unusually quiet all day, her gaze distant and her jaw tight. Ethan knew better than to push, but as the silence stretched thinner and thinner between them, he couldn't help himself. "Credit for your thoughts?" he asked lightly, bumping her shoulder with his own. Zara startled, then shot him a sidelong glance. "You don't want to know what I'm thinking, human," she said, her voice a low rasp. "Try me." She was silent for a long moment. Then, abruptly, she turned to face him, her amber eyes burning with an intensity that took his breath away. "I'm thinking," she said deliberately, "that I want to taste you, to feel your skin on my scales, to have you inside me, moving and gasping and crying out my name." Ethan's mouth went dry, his blood pounding in his ears. "Zara," he managed hoarsely. "We can't. I mean, I'm." "What? Valenth? The enemy?" She leaned in closer, her breath hot against his cheek. "Tell me, Ethan, do I feel like the enemy right now?" And then, before he could form a coherent thought, she was kissing him, a searing, desperate clash of lips and teeth and tongue that consumed him like wildfire. He responded instinctively, his hands coming up to tangle in her crest as he pulled her closer, drinking in the alien, intoxicating taste of her. They lost themselves in each other there on that rooftop, a tangle of limbs and heat, and he'd too long denied. The war, their respective sides, the very stars themselves faded away, until there was nothing but the slide of scale on skin, the ragged music of their shared breaths, the bright, sharp pleasure cresting between them. Afterwards, as they lay spent and panting in each other's arms, Ethan struggled to process the magnitude of what had just happened. This wasn't just fraternization, it was outright treason. If anyone found out. But as Zara nestled into his side, her claws tracing idle patterns on his chest, he found he couldn't bring himself to care. Let the consequences come. For this one, shining moment, he had found something real and vital amidst the horror and upheaval of war, something worth fighting for. "This is insane," he murmured into the velvet darkness. "You know that, right?" Zara huffed a laugh, her breath warm on his neck. "We're two enemy soldiers stranded alone on an abandoned planet at the ass end of space. I think we left sanity behind a long time ago." Ethan chuckled wryly. She had a point. Sanity had become a fluid concept out here, its edges blurred by isolation and need, and the constant specter of death. In a galaxy gone mad, maybe the most insane thing of all was to deny what little comfort and connection they could find. Even if that connection crossed every line in the book. They fell asleep like that, wrapped around each other beneath alien stars, the only two souls for light years. And for the first time in longer than Ethan could remember, the ever-present knot of tension in his gut loosened, replaced by something dangerously close to contentment. It couldn't last, of course. The real world, with all its complications and divided loyalties, still awaited them beyond the safe haven of the outpost walls. But for now, in this fragile, stolen moment of peace, they had each other. And that was enough. Worlds collide. The distant roar of engines shattered the pre-dawn stillness, jolting Ethan out of a restless sleep. Beside him, Zara stirred, her eyes snapping open as her whole body tensed. "Ships," she hissed, already reaching for her sidearm. Alliance or Imperium? Ethan was already moving, his pulse thundering as he scrambled for his boots and rifle. "Let's find out," he said grimly. "But either way, I think our little vacation just got cut short." They emerged from the outpost into the pale, watery light of dawn, scanning the horizon for the source of the noise. Ethan's heart sank as he caught sight of a familiar silhouette cresting the distant hills, the boxy, utilitarian lines of an Alliance troop transport. Reinforcements, finally. The cavalry, come to rescue their wayward soldier. Then why did he feel like he'd just been sentenced to death? Beside him, Zura muttered a guttural curse in her native tongue. She shot Ethan a look that was equal parts anger and raw, burning betrayal. "You called them," she snarled, her fingers tightening on her weapon. "This was your plan all along, wasn't it? To keep me docile, until your forces could come collect your prize." "What? No." Ethan gaped at her, stung by the accusation. "Zara, I swear, I had nothing to do with this. I'm just as surprised as you are." Her lip curled in a sneer, but before she could voice her disbelief, the transport crested the final hill and bore down on their position, its repulsors kicking up a blinding spray of sand and grit. It settled to the ground with a teeth-rattling thud, and suddenly Ethan found himself staring down the barrels of a dozen Alliance-issue pulse rifles. "Lieutenant Reeves." A familiar voice boomed across the no-man's land between them. "Stand down and step away from the Valanth." Ethan squinted through the settling dust, his stomach clenching as he recognized the burly figure at the head of the squad. Sergeant Hawkins, his old squad leader. A good man, a fair man, but a dyed-in-the-wool Alliance hardliner. He couldn't understand what had transpired between Ethan and Zara these past weeks. No one would. In their eyes, Zara wasn't a person. She was the enemy, a target. And by aligning himself with her, even for a moment, Ethan had made himself a traitor. Zara evidently reached the same conclusion. In one fluid motion, she raised her sidearm and aimed it squarely at Ethan's head, her amber eyes hard as flint. "Tell them to back off," she grated out, "or their lieutenant gets a plasma bolt between the eyes." Hawkins swore colorfully, and a dozen rifle muzzles snapped to aim at Zora's vitals. "Let him go, you scaly bitch," the surgeon growled, "or we'll put so many holes in you they'll be using you for target practice. Stop. Everyone, just stop." Ethan stepped forward, raising his hands in a placating gesture. Zara tensed but held her position, though he could practically feel the rage and betrayed hurt rolling off her in waves. "Sarge, listen," he said, keeping his voice steady with an effort. "She's not a threat. Zara saved my life, patched me up after the battle. We've been helping each other survive out here. There's no need for anyone else to die today." Hawkins' brows drew together like thunderclouds over his disbelieving glare. "She's an imp, Reeves. A spirit's damned, bloodthirsty alien killer. Or have you forgotten what her kind did to Nuevo Santiago? To Telos Prime?" Ethan swallowed hard, his mind flashing unbidden to the awful vids that had made the rounds after those massacres. The gutted colony domes, the bodies in the streets, the atrocities committed by Valanth shock troops as they overran human worlds, slaughtering civilians and soldiers alike. The same troops Zora had led into battle, time and time again. The same war Zara had devoted her life to, long before fate had brought them together in this blasted wasteland. The past rose up between them, vast and bloody and inescapable, and for a moment, Ethan wavered. How could he defend her, knowing all she had done, all she was? But then his gaze caught hers, and beneath the anger and anguish, he saw something else, a bone-deep weariness, an unspoken plea, not for mercy, not for absolution, but for him to see her, the real her, beneath the uniform and the battle scars, the woman who had held him through the long nights, who had shared her stories and her hopes and her fears, who had shown him, with every touch and whispered word, that even the most implacable of enemies was still a living, feeling being. A person. A person he had grown to care for, against all reason and logic. In that moment, the decision crystallized, as bright and sharp as fractured glass. He turned back to Hawkins, jaw set and eyes blazing. "No, Sarge, I haven't forgotten a thing. But this war, it's taken enough from us. From all of us. And I'm done letting it take more." He lowered his hands, slowly, deliberately, and stepped in front of Zora, shielding her with his body. "I'm not going to let you hurt her. She's more than what you see, more than what any of us knew." A shocked silence descended, broken only by the hum of idling engines and the ragged sound of Zora's breath behind him. Hawkins gaped at him, something like horror in his eyes as the magnitude of what Ethan was doing sank in. "Lieutenant, Ethan, you can't be serious. You're choosing her, over your own people." "I'm choosing," Ethan said softly, "what I know in my heart to be right. We have to break the cycle, Sarge. Somewhere. Somehow. Because if we don't, what will be left of any of us when the guns fall silent?" In the lengthening, dumbfounded silence, one last thought rose to the forefront of his mind. The echo of a sentiment Zora had voiced the first time she let him see her, truly see her. "I am more than my scars." For a long, breathless moment, Hawkins stared at him, his face a mask of warring emotions. His finger tightened on the trigger, then went slack as he lowered his rifle with a shuddering exhalation. "Spirits of soul," he muttered hoarsely. "They'll court-martial you for this, you know that." Ethan exhaled shakily, feeling the knot of tension between his shoulder blades unravel ever so slightly. "I know. And you're sure?" He reached back, his fingers entwining with Zora's cool, scaly ones, felt her grip tighten, lending him her iron strength. "I'm sure." Hawkins shook his head, his expression a mix of admiration and utter disbelief. "You crazy, idealistic son of a—" He waved a hand, and slowly, reluctantly, the other rifles lowered. "I hope you know what you're doing, Reeves." "Yeah," Ethan said softly, staring out over the war-torn landscape with eyes that suddenly saw the glimmer of a different future peeking through the smoke and blood. "Yeah, I think I do." At his back, he felt Zora's presence, solid and strong, and in that moment, he knew the truth that would carry them through whatever trials lay ahead. They were in this together, come what may. Two hearts, two worlds, bound by something stronger than loyalty, stronger than enmity. The war had brought them together. Now, maybe, just maybe, it was time to let something else define them. An impossible choice. The Valiant shuttle shuddered as another volley of plasma fire scorched across its shields, alarms blaring in protest. In the cockpit, Zara cursed viciously as she wrenched the controls, sending the craft into a stomach-churning spiral to evade their pursuers. "They're gaining on us," Ethan shouted over the cacophony, his eyes glued to the sensor display. "Two more fighters, coming in hot at 3 o'clock. Zara hissed through clenched teeth, her claws flying over the console as she redirected power to the rear deflectors. "I see them. Hold on." The shuttle lurched sickeningly as she threw it into a steep dive, the inertial dampeners struggling to compensate. Ethan's head slammed against the bulkhead, stars exploding across his vision, but he barely noticed. All his attention was focused on the two blips converging on their position, the ominous red glow of missile locks flashing on the screen. It had been like this for days now, ever since their ill-fated confrontation at the outpost. Word of their treason had spread like wildfire through both Alliance and Imperium channels. The human lieutenant and the Valith warrior who had turned their backs on their respective sides, who had dared to imagine a different way. They had been declared renegades, traitors, enemies of every sentient species in the galaxy. The Alliance wanted Ethan for court-martial and execution. The Imperium simply wanted Zora dead. And both sides had thrown every resource into hunting them down like rabid dogs. There was nowhere left to hide. No safe harbor, no friendly port. Just an endless, harrowing chase through the stars, their survival hanging on a thread of skill and desperation, and sheer dumb luck. Ethan knew it couldn't last, knew every hair's breadth escape, every momentary reprieve, only delayed the inevitable. But through it all, through the fear and exhaustion and soul-crushing weight of their impossible situation, Zara remained his rock, his fire, the one point of surety in a galaxy gone mad. He looked over at her now, watched the resolute intensity carved into every line of her face as she wrestled with the controls, felt the familiar swell of love and anguish in his chest at the sight. She was the bravest, most indomitable being he'd ever known. A warrior in mind, heart, and spirit, fearless and unflinching. She had already sacrificed so much just to be with him. Her rank, her people's respect, everything she had ever worked for. But he couldn't, wouldn't, let her sacrifice herself. Not like this. Not in some doomed last stand, futilely raging against the dying of the light. She deserved better than that, even if getting it meant shattering his own heart in the process. Zara. He scarcely recognized his own voice, lidden with dread. Zara, the jump drive. Is there enough power for a jump? She shot him a harried, disbelieving look. With those fighters right on our tail, we'd be a sitting rota in hyperspace. We have to take them out first. No, listen to me. With an enormous effort, Ethan steadied himself against the juddering bulkhead, met her eyes, trying to convey everything he couldn't say aloud. I need you to chart a jump. Get as far away from here as you can. Find someplace safe. Regroup with any other Imperium defectors who'll have you. Start over. Her amber gaze widened, her scales paling as the magnitude of his request sank in. You're not suggesting. One of us has to stay behind. Draw them off. He smiled, a fragile, wavering thing. And we both know I'm the more expendable one here. No. The word was a strangled growl, a flat denial. No, Ethan, you can't. I won't let you. You have to. He reached out, took her hand in his, felt the familiar rasp of scales against his calloused palm. Please, Zora. Everything we've done, everything we've been through, it was all so that you could live. Really live, not just survive. He lifted their joined hands to his lips, pressed a reverent kiss to her knuckles. Let me give that to you. Let me give your life back to you. For a long, airless moment, she stared at him, her expression a maelstrom of rage and anguish and searing, desperate love. Then, with a soft, broken sound, she hauled him in and kissed him fiercely, her fangs nearly drawing blood in her intensity. I love you, you stupid, stubborn human, she rasped against his mouth. You hear me. I love you. Don't you dare forget that. He huffed a wet, shaky laugh, cradling her face in his hands as he rested his forehead against the warm ridges of her crest. Never could. Not if I live 1,000 years. One last embrace, fierce and deep, and saying everything words never could. Then he was pulling away, his heart shattering with every step, as he headed for the rear hatch and the waiting escape pod. Get ready to jump on my mark, he called over his shoulder, proud of the way his voice barely trembled. And Zara. She looked up, her eyes gleaming with unused tears. Yes, Ethan. Give 'em hell out there. For both of us. Her lipless mouth curved in a knife's-edge smile, even as a single crystalline tear tracked down her cheek. Always, my love. Always. The jump klaxon sounded, and with one last, searing look, he slapped the hatch control and leaped into the void, watching the shuttle's running lights dwindle to pinpricks against the starfield as Zara escaped to freedom. Then he was alone, spinning in the black, watching the distant engine flares of his pursuers drawing ever nearer, at peace even in the face of his own destruction. Because he had made a difference. He, Ethan Reeves, disgraced Alliance lieutenant, had stood against the tide and shown the galaxy that there was another way, that even in the flames of war, in the crucible of hatred and division, there could be love, unity, hope. The first volley of plasma fire seared past his viewport, blindingly bright. The comm crackled with demands for his surrender, threats and condemnations snarled in a dozen Terran and Valanth dialects. Ethan just smiled, his eyes fixed on the distant gleam of an impossible future as he breathed his last. "Come on, then," he whispered to the stars. "Let's finish it. For Zara, for their love, for a dream of peace. Always. The end."